She said, "You're not listening?" I said, "You never told the truth." And just like that, everything between us began to unravel. The moment it all began to feel fragile wasn't marked by shouting or dramatic gestures. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it struck deeper than any argument could. I remember sitting across from her at the small cafe near her apartment, the kind of place that smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and old books. She was there first, as usual, already sipping from her mug, her posture poised but slightly tense. She had that quiet elegance about her, the kind that makes people notice without trying, and yet today, something about her presence felt weighted, as though the air around her carried memories I hadn't touched. She said, "You're not listening?" I recall. Her voice wasn't raised, it wasn't angry, but it carried the unmistakable edge of disappointment. That phrase, so simple yet so loaded, echoed in my mind. I realized, in that moment, that I had been hearing her words but never fully grasping the meaning behind them. There were things she had tried to communicate over time, hints of fear, moments of vulnerability, and I had brushed them aside, assuming I understood her when, in truth, I hadn't even scratched the surface. I tried to respond, but the words tangled in my throat. I wanted to explain, to defend myself, but every sentence felt inadequate. Instead, I watched her fingers trace the rim of her coffee cup, noticing the subtle tension in her knuckles, the small, unconscious gestures she made when she was holding something back. Her eyes, a deep hazel that always seemed to study and weigh every moment, avoided mine for a fraction of a second before darting back, searching for a reaction. Inside, I felt a strange mix of guilt and defensiveness. I wanted to tell her I had tried, that I had listened, but even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't enough. My failures weren't in hearing her words, they were in not understanding the silences between them, the moments where truth was cloaked in hesitation. And then, almost as if reading my thoughts, she added nothing more, leaving the air between us heavy with unspoken truths. There was a subtle, almost magnetic tension in the space separating us. I noticed the faint warmth of her hand when it brushed against the table as she leaned forward to emphasize a point. I saw the quiet vulnerability hidden beneath her confident posture, the soft sigh that betrayed her own frustration. It was in these small gestures, these delicate movements, that the depth of our unspoken conflict revealed itself. For a moment, I considered reaching across, letting my hand hover near hers. But I hesitated. The last thing I wanted was to bridge the distance too quickly, to impose my understanding before earning hers. Instead, I leaned back slightly, absorbing every detail, the faint hum of the cafe, the aroma of coffee, the way the sunlight caught strands of her hair, framing her face in a halo of quiet intensity. And in that moment I knew that our story, one of unspoken feelings, hidden truths, and slow-burning connection, was about to begin. It wasn't explosive or immediate, it was fragile, subtle, and entirely human. The fracture had appeared, small and almost invisible, but it would shape everything that followed. After that afternoon at the cafe, there was a silence that lingered longer than I expected. It wasn't uncomfortable in the usual sense. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your chest, the kind that forces you to confront what you've been avoiding. I found myself walking through familiar streets, replaying her words over and over. "You're not listening." Not in an accusatory tone, but as a truth I had failed to see, a quiet revelation that pricked at my own defenses. When I met her again, it was in her apartment, a warm, sunlit space lined with bookshelves and soft, inviting furniture. She moved with her usual grace, but there was a subtle hesitation in her movements, like a wall had risen between us overnight. I tried to start a light conversation about mundane things, the weather, a new book I'd started, but her responses were careful, measured. Each word felt deliberate, as though she were testing whether I would truly listen this time. And in that careful distance, I noticed the small tells I had missed before, the way her hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, fingers brushing against the teacup with a rhythm that seemed almost nervous, the slight frown in her brow when she thought I wasn't paying attention, the faint shift of her weight when she leaned back, keeping a fraction more space than usual. I realized then how much she had been hiding, and how much I had assumed. Her past, I began to understand, was layered with complexities I had never paused to explore. Moments she had omitted or glossed over weren't lies in the usual sense. They were protective shields, carefully placed to guard a vulnerability I hadn't earned the right to see. And I, in my youthful certainty, had often mistaken her discretion for distance, failing to recognize the courage it took for her to even sit across from me and let me in. The room seemed to shrink around us, carrying the weight of unspoken truths. I felt a knot in my chest, a mix of frustration at myself and empathy for her. I wanted to apologize, to say I understood, but words felt clumsy, incapable of bridging the gap. Instead, I observed her quietly, letting my gaze linger on the subtle movements, the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the soft sigh that accompanied her pause, the flicker of emotion in her eyes that she tried to mask with a calm exterior. For the first time, I realized that listening wasn't just about hearing words. It was about perceiving the silences, reading the spaces between gestures, understanding the emotions she hadn't voiced. And as I sat there, trying to align my awareness with hers, I felt the first cracks in my own defenses. My assumptions, my impatience, my misunderstanding of her subtle cues, all were laid bare in the quiet intimacy of that moment. Though the distance remained, it was no longer insurmountable. Each glance, each hesitant smile, each small, deliberate movement carried the weight of trust being tested and rebuilt. The walls were still there, yes, but I could see the seams, the places where careful attention and patient understanding might one day allow me to step inside. And I knew, deep down, that if I wanted to understand her, I would need to listen in a way I never had before, truly, completely, without the filters of assumption or pride. The moments we shared after the cafe and apartment meetings were quiet but charged with subtle meaning. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden breakthroughs, only a slow, careful unraveling of walls we hadn't realized we had built. I found myself seeking her company more often, not out of obligation or curiosity, but from an almost magnetic pull, a desire to simply be near her, to observe the small, unspoken truths that danced across her expressions. One afternoon, she invited me to help organize old photographs she had recently discovered while cleaning her apartment. I had expected a mundane task, but as soon as we spread the pictures across the wooden table, the air shifted. Each photograph carried a story, of travels, of laughter, of moments both ordinary and extraordinary. As she recounted the memories, I noticed how her eyes softened when describing a distant friend, how her lips curved in a fleeting, almost hidden smile at a memory I hadn't shared. We spoke little, but in those silences, there was a growing understanding. I handed her a photo carefully, my fingers brushing hers ever so slightly, and the warmth of her skin lingered longer than expected. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand held mine for a moment, just enough to create a bridge between us, delicate and unspoken. That small gesture, seemingly insignificant, carried more weight than any words could. As the afternoon stretched, our conversation ebbed and flowed between memory and present reality. She laughed softly at a photograph of herself years younger, her voice warm and melodic, filling the room in a way that felt intimate and grounding. I couldn't help but notice the contrast between her confidence in front of the camera and the vulnerability I glimpsed in these quiet moments. Every subtle movement, the brush of her hair from her face, the tilt of her head, the way she leaned forward slightly when sharing a memory, spoke volumes. There was a tension between us, silent and simmering, that I felt in every glance and every pause. I wanted to close the distance, to lean in and speak the thoughts I hadn't dared to voice, but I restrained myself. There was beauty in restraint, in allowing her to reveal herself at her own pace. Instead, I listened, truly listened, not only to her words but to the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the soft shifting of her body, the sighs that accompanied each story she told. By the end of the afternoon, a subtle closeness had formed. Our hands met again briefly as we packed the photographs away, lingering just long enough to make the silence meaningful. I felt the first real spark of connection, not through dramatic gestures or confessions, but through the shared understanding that had quietly grown between us. That day, I realized that intimacy wasn't just about speaking or revealing everything at once. It was about the quiet gestures, the small touches, the way our presence alone could communicate volumes. And as I left her apartment, the warmth of her hand still fresh in my memory, I knew that this slow, careful journey of understanding, of truly seeing her, was just beginning. The quiet understanding we had been nurturing seemed to crumble one evening, not with an eruption but with the slow, deliberate collision of truth and frustration. We were sitting in her living room, the space now familiar yet suddenly heavy with unspoken words. Outside, the sky was painted with the fading amber of sunset, soft light spilling across the floorboards, but inside, the atmosphere was taut, as if every shadow carried our hesitation. It started with a simple observation, one of those minor comments that suddenly unearths buried feelings. She looked at me, her hazel eyes steady yet glinting with something I couldn't immediately name, and said, "You never really listen, do you?" There was no anger, just a quiet insistence, a plea wrapped in calmness. Her words struck me more sharply than any raised voice could have. I opened my mouth to reply, to explain, to defend myself, but what came out was blunt, honest, and unpolished. "And you've never really told the truth." The room went silent for a beat that felt like an eternity. Our carefully balanced connection, built over shared moments and gentle gestures, trembled under the weight of honesty. I saw her eyes flicker, a mixture of hurt, surprise, and guarded vulnerability. And I realized, in that instant, that this confrontation was necessary. It wasn't about blame or accusation. It was about laying bare the truths we had both skirted, about finally seeing each other fully, flaws, fears, and all. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she leaned back, folding her arms loosely across her chest, yet there was a subtle shift, a silent acknowledgement that she was allowing herself to be vulnerable, even if hesitantly. I watched her, noticing the way the fading sunlight caught strands of hair around her face, the small tremor in her hand as she rested it on the arm of the couch. I tried to soften my tone, to explain that my frustration came not from mistrust, but from confusion and a desperate desire to understand her. She responded, voice low but clear, recounting moments when she had held back because she wasn't ready for me to know, moments I had never asked about, moments I had assumed I understood. Our words collided, then slowly intertwined, like a dance of tension and tentative connection. Every glance, every pause, every subtle shift in posture was a message in itself. Her shoulders relaxed fractionally when I reached toward her, hand hovering close but not pressing, giving her the space to decide whether to accept my reach. Her eyes softened for just a moment, and I felt the fragile bridge between us start to solidify again. By the end of the conversation, we weren't completely resolved, but the walls had begun to crack. There was honesty now where before there had been assumption, clarity where confusion had lingered. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more honest, more human. As I left that evening, the lingering warmth of her presence stayed with me, the subtle scent of her perfume, the memory of her hesitant touch on the armrest, the quiet strength behind her vulnerability. I understood then that this confrontation wasn't an ending. It was a turning point, a necessary unraveling that would allow real connection to grow. After the tension of our confrontation, there was a quiet fragility in our interactions. The air between us felt lighter than the previous storm, yet every word, every gesture, carried a new weight, the weight of honesty, vulnerability, and cautious hope. We met again on a Sunday afternoon, her apartment bathed in soft sunlight, the kind that warms the skin and softens the edges of everything it touches. It was quiet, peaceful, yet underneath, the threads of our unspoken emotions hummed softly, waiting to be acknowledged. We didn't rush into conversation. Instead, we sat together on the couch, shoulders almost touching, her arm brushing against mine in a fleeting, accidental way. I felt a warmth spread from that small contact, subtle yet significant. It was a fragile connection, but it was there, a bridge slowly being rebuilt. She looked at me, eyes searching mine with a mixture of caution and tentative trust. I could see the vulnerability that she had carefully shielded before, now slipping through in small glimpses. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but steady. I've been afraid," she admitted, almost whispering. The words weren't dramatic, but they carried the weight of years of self-protection, of careful restraint. I listened, truly listened, letting the silence between her sentences hold as much meaning as her words. I responded with honesty as well, sharing the moments when I had felt lost, frustrated, and unsure how to reach her. There was no defensiveness this time, only clarity, the kind that comes from knowing the stakes of connection. As I spoke, I noticed her fingers tracing the edge of a cushion, a small, nervous gesture that revealed how deeply she felt each word. We laughed softly together at a shared memory, a subtle sound that broke some of the remaining tension. The sound was light, fleeting, but it filled the room with a sense of normalcy and intimacy. I reached out cautiously, letting my hand hover near hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, our fingers brushed lightly, a deliberate, careful contact that sent a ripple of warmth through both of us. It was an acknowledgement, unspoken but powerful, that we were both willing to try again, to rebuild what had been strained. Throughout the afternoon, small gestures became the language of our reconnection. She leaned closer when passing me a book. I offered my jacket when a breeze drifted through the open window. Our knees brushed briefly as we reached for the same photograph. Each moment was tiny, seemingly ordinary, yet it carried the weight of trust being cautiously restored. By the time I left, the sunlight had shifted, casting a warm glow across the room. Our goodbye was gentle, lingering, a hand on the arm, a shared smile, a look that spoke volumes. We weren't completely healed, but the first threads of true understanding had been rewoven between us. In that fragile, tender afternoon, I realized that connection isn't always built on grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the subtle touch, the quiet admission, the shared laughter, and the patience to let each other unfold at our own pace. For the first time in a long while, I felt hope that we could move forward, together, carefully, honestly. By now, our interactions had settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and charged, a delicate balance of trust, caution, and quiet desire. The confrontations and fragile reconciliations of the past weeks had shifted something between us. We no longer tiptoed around each other with tentative uncertainty. Instead, there was a growing ease, a silent acknowledgement that what existed between us was worth nurturing, worth protecting, even if either of us fully understood it yet. One late afternoon, we went for a walk in a nearby park. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows and bathing everything in a warm, golden light. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and faint perfume she always seemed to wear effortlessly. We walked side by side, not speaking much, yet every step and glance was laden with meaning. The occasional brush of our arms or hands felt electric, a subtle reminder of the intimacy we were cultivating without needing to define it. She paused by a wooden bench, settling into its worn, inviting surface, and I joined her. For a few moments, we simply watched the world around us, children laughing, dogs chasing after sticks, leaves drifting lazily on the breeze. There was a comforting silence in our shared observation, a kind of understanding that didn't require words. I felt her shoulder lightly press against mine as she shifted, a touch so small and natural that it seemed to convey everything she couldn't say outright. Finally, she spoke, voice soft but steady. "I feel like I can breathe when I'm with you," she admitted, almost like she was confessing a secret to the universe rather than to me. The honesty in her tone, the way her fingers flexed slightly against the bench's edge, told me that she was opening herself up in ways she hadn't before. I responded not with grand declarations, but with quiet reassurance, letting her feel the sincerity in my gaze and the calm steadiness of my presence. We spoke sparingly, choosing each word carefully, aware that silence often carried more weight than dialogue. And yet, in the pauses, the unspoken sentiments were palpable. A lingering glance, a subtle smile, the warmth of hands nearly touching, occasionally brushing fingertips by accident and then holding the contact a second longer than expected. Each small gesture was a reinforcement of the trust and understanding we were carefully constructing. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, I realized that the moments we were sharing weren't just steps toward emotional reconciliation, they were the foundation of intimacy. Not the fiery, impulsive kind, but the slow, steady burn of connection built on vulnerability, patience, and quiet affection. It was the kind of intimacy that lingered in memory, in the heartbeat of a glance, in the warmth of a hand lightly held. When we finally rose to leave, we walked slowly, side by side, the comfort of our closeness grounding us. There were no promises yet, no declarations, just an unspoken understanding. We were learning to navigate each other's worlds, to honor the walls that had once divided us while cherishing the bridges we were building. That evening, as I left her side, I carried with me a quiet certainty that true connection didn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply whispered, and that whisper was enough. The weeks of quiet tension, fragile reconciliation, and careful understanding led us to a moment that felt like both an ending and a beginning. It was evening when I found myself at her apartment again, the familiar warmth of her space embracing me before she even spoke. The room was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, painting her features with a gentle warmth that made her look both approachable and untouchable at the same time, graceful, confident, yet carrying that quiet vulnerability I had grown to recognize and cherish. We sat together on the couch, shoulders brushing lightly, the kind of contact that was charged without needing to be declared. This time, there was no tension, no hesitation, only the calm knowledge that our connection had survived the storms of misunderstanding and unspoken truths. She looked at me with those hazel eyes that had seen so much, and for the first time, I felt fully seen in return. "I've been scared," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet firm enough to carry the weight of honesty. "Scared that you wouldn't understand me, that I'd never be able to trust fully." She let her hand rest near mine, leaving the space for me to reach, if I chose. I did, letting my fingers brush against hers, holding the contact with deliberate tenderness. I smiled, feeling a swell of emotion I had been holding back for weeks. "I don't fully understand everything yet," I admitted, my voice quiet, reflective. "But I want to. I want to be here, for the parts of you that are easy to see and the ones you've kept hidden. I'm willing to wait, to listen, to try." Her lips curved into a soft, almost shy smile, and for a moment, the air seemed to hum with unspoken promises. There was no rush to define what came next. The intimacy wasn't in grand gestures, but in the lingering touch of hands, in the gentle brush of shoulders, in the way our eyes held each other's gaze without needing words. The connection was slow, deliberate, and fully human, exactly what we had both needed. She leaned in slightly, and our foreheads touched lightly, a gesture so simple yet filled with trust and affection. I could feel the rhythm of her breath, steady but calm, matching my own, and in that synchronized quiet, the unspoken tension dissolved completely. We had traversed the difficult terrain of misunderstanding, confrontation, and vulnerability, and now we were here, fully present, fully aware, and fully willing to step forward together. The evening stretched on with quiet conversation, shared laughter, and comfortable silences. Every small gesture, a hand brushing against mine, a shoulder nudging in warmth, a fleeting glance, spoke volumes more than words ever could. And as I left her apartment later, the world outside seemed brighter, more alive. I carried with me the certainty that our connection, slow burning and patiently nurtured, had blossomed into something real. We weren't rushing, and we weren't forced into labels or declarations. But in the quiet, lingering touches and the trust we had rebuilt, we had found the resolution we both needed. Together, yet cautious, yet certain in the knowledge that honesty, patience, and care had finally bridged the gap between us. And in that knowledge, I realized, some stories aren't about fireworks or sudden revelations, they're about the slow, steady light that grows stronger when nurtured, tenderly and unhurriedly, until it becomes impossible to ignore.